Thank you to National Cancer Center. Thank you to LinkJ and for my fellow presenters for this opportunity to speak. It's really my pleasure to speak today about the Japanese biotech ecosystem and how we can together compete more on the global stage. Most of my slides will have a translation on the right, so I apologize if it's hard to keep up with my English, but hopefully the translation on the right will be sufficient to make my points across. I'm currently managing partner, as Sato-san said, of AN Venture Partners. On behalf of AN Venture Partners, I'm also CEO of Capacity Bio, that I worked closely with Inaba Taro at Remedist to create. This company has raised about $35 million from top US investors. And I'm also the CEO of Typewriter Therapeutics, that I think my founder, Fujiwara Haruhiko, I think is participating today, but we have the privilege of supporting him. Prior to this, I worked very closely with the Remedist team, who I still work closely with, and I led their company creation efforts. Before that, I'm a multi-time founder and CEO of a handful of different companies with about 20 years of experience as a scientist, executive, and investor, and originally at Command of Stanford with a Kaufman Fellowship as well. So a little bit about AN Ventures before I hit my topic. We were founded very recently in alliance with Arch Venture Partners and the Japanese government. For those of you who don't know Arch, it's been around for almost 40 years, over 300 investments with 10 billion US dollars under management. What's special about Arch for us is they really are at the top level on the global stage, and that's why we've chosen to partner with them. In 2018, 20% of all global venture-backed biotech investments were participated by Arch. In 2019, they were the most active global biotech investor for Series A, and in 2020, the most active Series B investor. And I think the logos on the bottom represent them best. There are some really famous success stories there scientifically, as well as for patients, and of course, financially as well. Okay, so what is our objective? Well, first and foremost, ANV's objective is to grow the Japanese biotech ecosystem. To do that, we have a handful of key strategies. First, we are going to source our science primarily, not exclusively, but primarily from Japan. However, we think the ingredients or the ecosystem in Japan is not fully developed enough yet to compete on the global stage, which is part of the reason I'm presenting here today. So initially, we will invest and develop, meaning company creation, what we think are billion-dollar potential biotech companies, but we'll focus on global development. That means when we create our companies, we'll largely create US companies, we'll add US or global leadership teams as necessary, and ultimately all of our companies will target NASDAQ listings. Equally important for that is working with global talent and global investors, because part of this feedback loop to the ecosystem that we think will help Japan is right now, most Japanese companies, most Japanese funds have to go to the US and say, hey, look at me, mite kudasai. Eventually, if we're successful, what we want is for global investors and global talent to be coming to Japan and saying, what do you guys have? What's interesting? And when that happens, I think there'll be a mature enough ecosystem that eventually there's no reason that there can't be a domestic Japanese biotech company that lists on the NASDAQ for $1 billion. Every other country in the world, the top 10, top 15, have this, except Japan. And I hope we can all work together to change that in the next 5 to 10 years. Okay, why should you do this? Naze yaru iyu ga aru ka? Well, we're focused on bringing Japanese science to the global stage, and we think you should too, because it's just as difficult to do it domestically in Japan. It costs the same amount to get drugs approved, but the rewards are substantially higher in the US. If you're going to spend 10 years of your life working on science that you spent the last 20 years working on, why not make sure it maximizes in its potential? it reaches the most patients globally. And to do that, you need to compete on the global stage. Okay, so let's look a little bit in the feedback loop here. So our initial objective as a fund is to create a global success based on Japanese science. And the way this is going to help the ecosystem is that success will, of course, bring accolades, and it will bring financial profit to the founders, the research institutes, and the universities. And hopefully that success case will bring inspiration and confidence for others to follow. Because that success case will bring along the investors, will bring along the executives, and bring along the employees, such that there'll be more experienced founders in Japan. This, I think, is one of the biggest deficiencies today in the ecosystem, are talent who've taken companies public in the US or taken them to billion-dollar outcomes on the US. And really, that's something that we can help contribute to the growth and development of those types of people. And what I mean by experience is not just about financing or business. Actually, I think one of the areas that the US is truly globally the strongest is translation from basic and applied research to commercial application. That translation is where I think the Japanese ecosystem really needs to gain some more strength and momentum. And ultimately, these two will combine to bring higher quality startups with more experienced leadership to Japan. Why does that help? Well, when these global success cases come out of Japan, as I said, eventually what we want are global investors coming to Japan because it's much less competitive. Right? I live in San Francisco. I spend a lot of time in Boston. You go to the famous professors there, there's a line out the door of VCs wanting to talk to them. In Japan, that's not the case yet. So there's many great ideas and not a lot of people funding them. So by having a global success case, we think that'll bring more investors to Japan, and they'll invest in more of these higher quality startups such that the Japanese ecosystem grows. It's a virtuous cycle. For what it's worth, if this roadmap seems familiar, it's exactly how Silicon Valley was started. And I was born at Stanford. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I lived my whole life there. So I've seen the story play over and over and over again. Okay, so to not make this purely academic, I wanted to talk very personally about a case that, again, I worked very closely with a Remedis team and Taro Inaba on, because I want you to experience what we experienced, right? It's something that in the US we see much more of, which is, transparency, both good and bad, right? So I want to use a case study for which, again, we're an investor and ultimately was a success. So this is a company that when we first started looking at it a couple of years ago, it had the lead asset with multiple disease models in vivo, a second asset with phase 1 clinical data complete, and about 10 years of academic work. How long did it take? In January of 2021, Remedis expressed initial interest, led by Taro Inaba. I joined the DD process. About 6 months later, we seeded this company. Remedis seeded this company. From there, we spent about 4 months laying out a translation plan and a fundraising plan before in December of 2021, we started VC outreach in earnest. About 5 months later, we were about complete with a term sheet with RA Capital. And then for those of you familiar, the biotech ecosystem in the US really came to a halt for about 4 months. It took about 5 months, September 22, for those conversations to be revived. And ultimately, we closed a $35 million financing in December of last year. Okay, statistically, I've been fortunate to have raised quite a lot of money and have strong ties. And here were our statistics. We talked to 67 we reached out to 67 venture funds. We held first meetings with 50, CDAs with 25, and then the final syndicate discussion, we had 7. I would say, rule of thumb, you should expect over a year for most of these financings to take place. Okay, let's look at that a little bit more chronologically. So how do you get these first meetings? The 4 kind of major areas of initial meetings are your existing network, introductions through your friends, colleagues, et cetera. Of course, investor conferences, pitch competitions, et cetera. And sometimes sometimes investors will look at your publications, look at your conference presentations, and reach out to you. Okay, but any one of those things can lead to a first meeting. Typically, in order to get your first meeting, you need a good non-confidential deck, which I'll spend some more time talking about in a second, because I think it's one of the most important things that just takes some practice. It's not necessarily about your science. Okay, after first meeting, sometimes there could be more than one non-confidential meeting. You'll get to hopefully a CDA or under CDA meeting. This can take 1 to 2 months depending on investor. Important thing to note, if I'm an investor and I sign a CDA with you, I expect new information that I hadn't seen before. So it's something to keep in mind when you stage your non-confidential deck. You need to make sure there's exciting data under a CDA. Once you get past your CDA, this is when it's really real. Okay, real scientific diligence happens after the CDA. It could be anywhere from 3 to 9 months. Okay, for Capacity Bio, we spent 10 months in diligence with RA Capital, of course, with a little bit of a pause, 10 months, just as a data point. At the end of that, if an investor, a lead investor reaches a decision, and this usually requires an investment committee, 投資委員会かな、日本語では, to put out a term sheet. And then it's not over either. After the term sheet's signed, then you need to assemble the investor syndicate, get through final due diligence, and close your financing, which can take another 2 to 3 minutes. So to overlay the capacity experience, we had outreach to 67. This was almost entirely our existing network. Again, I know I have a little bit of an advantage here in that I have a strong network. And because of that, we were able to land first meetings in 50 of those cases. So this is whatever, 75% of the time. This is very high. Normally, I think it's like 25%. We also had a 50% conversion to CDAs. And then 7 were in the conversation with syndicate, and ultimately we closed with 4 investors. Now, what I want to speak a little bit about today is where I think often the most addressable failure is not getting the first meeting or not getting the second meeting. Of course, you know, if your company strategy is not good and you fail in due diligence, actually that's not horrible, because at least you got someone to look really carefully at your company. So really what I want to focus on is this first step, which is the non-confidential study. And in my experience, and I've seen hundreds, if not 1,000 of non-confidential decks, most of them are pretty poor, actually. But I think the good news, it's a very developable skill, and there's a methodology which I'll spend the next 10 minutes explaining my way of approaching it to you today. And I do want to note the text box that I wrote here on the bottom. This is not something specific to Japan. Okay, most US startups have these same issues. And I really enjoy mentoring. And so almost all the CEO and founder mentoring that I do are exactly on this topic of how to communicate your story better. And the main thing I always start with is most companies start with like, well, when I was a graduate student, I did this. And then when I was a postdoc, I did this. And then I had this surprising result. And 15 minutes later, you get to the conclusion. And I stopped paying attention after 3 minutes. So I'm somewhere else by the time you get to the conclusion. So always start with a conclusion. Why is it important to patients? Why is it important to customer society? So for Capacity's case, for example, we are important because we enable treatment of mitochondria-related diseases that are otherwise untreatable. Okay, because why is interesting, now I'm paying attention as an investor, so I can listen to how you think you will achieve this goal. Okay, well, how Capacity thinks we can achieve that goal is because we have first-in-class drugs that affect the full mitophagy cascade. Okay, that's believable. And what makes you confident you can do that? Okay, well, here's some data to support that thesis. And here's our team that can achieve that goal. Now, at the end of all this, if I'm still interested, then I want to ask, okay, what do you need, right? You're raising $5 million, $500 million, please tell me. In our case, we were raising $30 million. Now, the basis for this has a lot of science behind it. There's a well-known social scientist named Simon Sinek, who's published on the Golden Circle. I would encourage you to go read his blog or his book. I don't have a link here, but if you Google Simon Sinek, Golden Circle, it'll come up very quickly. And in the interest of time, I won't repeat, but the fundamental concepts that I showed here are based on his teachings. Okay, so now that you have an objective of how to communicate your story, I want to provide a methodology for how to effectively reduce that into slides. And the best way to develop slides, in my opinion, is to not start with slides. Start with a blurb. Okay, a blurb is a few sentences in the most concise way that tells someone else what your company is trying to do. Imagine if you meet your friend from college at an izakaya and they're saying, hey, I'm starting a new company. And they say, what do you do? And you have 5 sentences to tell them what you're doing. Okay, this is what a blurb is. It's the most concise way to tell why, how, what, and then if it's someone who could potentially invest in you, then an ask, okay? Once you've done your blurb, the blurb translates into outline points. Again, no slides yet. Based on those sentences, what are the key points you want to make in the same order? Junjo kaenaide. So in the same order. And then only then do you have your key points on you want to make. Then, only then, would I suggest you start working on slide framework and then optimize your slides. I think all too often, especially for science-heavy companies, you start with a graph or a chart or an in vivo print, and I want to hear that 7 slides in. Because if I don't know why, I don't really understand the context of why that data is really important. Also, another reason to start with why, this translation issue, that comes in why and how. It doesn't come in what, right? So what indication are we going to go after? How long is it going to take? How much money is it going to cost? All that is in why and how, not in what. Okay, again, I want to be very transparent. So I'm going to literally show you the blurb that we used for Capacity Bio to ultimately have a successful financing. In the interest of time, especially because it's all in English on the left, I'm not going to read it, but the first sentence is why. And my colleague translated it in Japanese, so hopefully you can read that on your own. I have 2 how sentences next. And then what? Our lead compound, IND ready, going after XYZ indication, and what's our pipeline, and then ask. And I think some of my former Remegis colleagues are on this call, but they can attest that our slide deck followed this exact order in terms of how our slides were presented, and it was about 15 slides. Okay, what is your goal for the first investor meeting? Also, I think something that needs to be improved globally, but in particular in Japan. The goal for your first meeting is to get the second meeting. And if typically only 25% or less of first meetings lead to second meetings, how can you improve the yield? How can you improve the statistics? Well, you have to get feedback, right? You have to ask questions about what they need to see. So like one of the most common mistakes I see is if you have a 30-minute meeting and someone comes to spend 30 minutes talking to me, they're not going to hear my opinions. So they're never going to get better, right? They're never going to get investor feedback. I'm not suggesting that all feedback is good, but you should get as much feedback as possible. How might I do that? Okay, so again, 30-minute meeting, no more than 15 minutes of planned presentation. Let them ask questions. If they don't ask questions, you should ask questions. What are your biggest concerns? What additional data would you want to see? I think that question is what people like founder scientists are the most afraid to ask. What additional data do you want to see? 何が物足りないか。聞きづらいですね、時々これは。特に自分の技術だと。It's the most important question to ask, right? Because you want to hear what potentially you're missing. Good investors will tell you this, not in a critical way, in a constructive way. But if they don't tell you, you should ask. And then lastly, is this in scope for your fund? Again, this type of critical question from the entrepreneur is not just an issue in Japan, it's also an issue in the US, but I see more of it in Japan. I don't know if it's a cultural thing, but I highly encourage you to ask these questions. Also, as an investor, this signals to me that you're willing to take feedback, that you're collaborative. Okay, again, one of my strongest recommendations is to get feedback from investors. What else? Yes, you should also ask about their investment size, Make sure you do your homework. What's their investment process and timeline? When should we follow up? Should it be in 2 weeks? When people don't ask me these questions, to me, it signals they've never gone through a financing before. Okay, so just conveying that you kind of know what you're doing a little bit is always helpful. Okay, lastly, self-reflection, and then I'll wrap up here. You should look at yourself in the mirror and understand what your strengths and weaknesses are. If you choose to go and raise funds globally, do you have the team to be able to do that? Or do you need some support? If the answer is need support, even if you don't know who those people are, actually tell the investors, hey, we need a CEO, or I need a CMO who speaks English, or I need a CFO because I don't have a finance background. It's much better if you're able to self-reflect about your weaknesses and identify them to an investor than an investor saying, hey, that's a weakness for you. That's a weakness, truly. If you identify yourself, it's almost a strength, right? So to summarize here, we think Japan has great science. My colleagues at Remigis, I think UTech, Beyond Next, I think there's some others who might be on this call. There's great science here, clearly. It is worthy of global investors' attention, but we as investors, we need your help as entrepreneurs and scientists to have those seeds, the tane, that we can help build into global companies. It is true. It is going to be much harder to develop your company globally than it will be in just Japan. But if some people don't break the Galapagos syndrome, if they're not those first few courageous entrepreneurs who are willing to take that scrutiny and succeed on the global level, we'll be stuck in the same ecosystems forever. And we at AN Ventures are very committed to work with you to try and break that. Finally, if your science fails, that's unfortunate, but science fails all the time in innovation, and that's an acceptable outcome as far as most US investors are concerned. If you can't advance your science because you can't communicate a strategy or plan, that's unfortunate. That's a shame. And these are skills that can be practiced and developed. And if you can't find that skill within, bring someone in who can help you, right? That's not a great reason to fail. And my fourth point is global teams might be a more immediate answer, right? It might be difficult to find all these skill sets that you want in Japan today. And that's fine. It's a global world. You can use LinkedIn or recruiters and others to track those talent. So with that, I'll end exactly at 23 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the remaining few minutes that I have.